Today's lecture is going to be about the topic we had last week, culture is ideology, but as you can see in the parentheses, I say is continued. So we really left off with kind of the classic vision that Marx provided of this relationship between the base and superstructure, and then we had a bunch of readings that tried to use that reflection theory to understand various aspects of culture. This week we're actually going to look at some thinkers in the 20th century that really tried to stay inside of what we call the critical tradition of looking at the relationship between society and culture. And when you hear this term critical tradition, you should think of a tradition of people that are trying to operate with Marxist concepts, but to make them actually work better, to try to apply them to new historical conditions long after Marx has passed. In this critical condition of analysis of society and culture that uses this concept of ideology as an important central concept, there's always an attention to the relation between culture, the system of culture, the aspects of culture, and the forces of economics and politics. That's one important characteristic. And it assumes that there is kind of a close relationship to these things. Now, that classic Marxist approach, as I showed you last week, is that there's a direct reflection. But as some of the research that we read last week showed, and as our writings this week show, as we've moved into a more modern society in the 20th and 21st century, that simple idea of direct reflection, that economic relations just produce this particular cultural thing, doesn't quite work when you look around you and realize just how complex culture can be in terms of social beliefs, in terms of products of culture, and all sorts of stuff like that. So our research that we read last week, those examples kind of gave you an inkling that reflection theory couldn't just be applied willy-nilly to understand society. And our thinkers this week operate in that same critical spirit of wanting to figure out how we can use attention to politics and economics to help us understand culture. We're really going to kind of look at two main schools of within this critical condition, or I should say main approaches. One is this approach that focuses on a concept called hegemony, and I'll explain that in a second. But this is particularly associated with the Marxist activists from the 1920s, whose name was Antonio Gramsci. Right, I just wrote Gramsci right there. And then the other approach that we're going to look at is what's known as the mass culture approach. And in particular, the introduction of this term, the culture industry. So this are our topics for this week's lecture and this week's readings. And then next week, we're actually going to take some of these concepts of the culture industry, but we're going to spin it in a new way. We'll find that next week there are sociologists out there that like thinking in terms of the culture industry, but realize that kind of a critical Marxist approach isn't the best. But for this week, we'll stay with this approach, see what it has to tell us, and how it kind of spurs us to think critically about the nature of culture in our society today. A couple of quick announcements. You should have seen by now that I took off one of the readings for this week. I would much rather have you kind of look at two provocative readings and think those through a little bit than kind of overwhelm you with readings. So make sure you see that announcement of removing one of the readings. And then in case you haven't gotten into the readings this week, they're dense, but they're dense in a different way than other readings we've done. They're dense because they're provocative. These are both readings, Adorno and Horkheimer, who do the first reading, and then Frank, who does the second reading, writing decades apart. Frank really is writing in the 90s, Adorno and Horkheimer in the 40s. You'll see that there's a same kind of critical edge of trying to really help to point out what they see as real problems in society, but in particular real problems with the way people in our society think and understand the world around them. So again, they're operating within this critical tradition of which ideology, which you remember is a kind of a false explanation of the nature of reality, an explanation that mystifies the actual nature of economic and political reality. Our authors are operating in that tradition and trying to show us how oftentimes what we think of as or what these authors call the culture industry, so media and movies and entertainment, the effect that that has on us. So these are meant to be provocative readings, and then the discussion post this week is a little bit exploratory, basically trying to get you to think like one of these authors, and to think about this funny little term, reality show. The Frank reading in particular should help you think about that, because his whole article is about this idea that there's an alternative culture out there. And as he shows us, once you expose the economic and mass culture roots of alternative culture, you realize that it's an alternative to what? In his view, an alternative to nothing, because it's no different than all this other mass culture. So enjoy those readings as much as you can, and enjoy the reading, the kind of thinking process this week. So let me say one more thing about what our concepts or our authors this week, how they're thinking of the term culture. So we've seen this term culture means quite many different things, and depending how we define it, depends what we look for in the relationship between society and culture, as well as what we think culture is and what it does. These folks this week kind of think of culture as kind of a big force. So it's kind of the overarching set of ideas and institutions, especially entertainment and media institutions that produce stuff, records, movies, books, all that sort of thing. So they're kind of thinking of culture in this kind of big, broad sense. And importantly, they're connecting it very closely to modern mass societies. So we're talking 20th and 21st century here, modern, technologically advanced societies. And they're connecting it to what economic and political interests want to achieve in society. So what they're really helping us to look at is, where does mass culture come from? What's the content of it? So what is the kind of basic description of what's in mass culture? And then what's the purpose of culture, thinking in terms of ideology, that these authors see in society. So here we go. First off, to Antonio Gramsci. Personally, he's one of my favorite theorists. He actually is a Marxist in the 1920s in Italy. And he, along with 3 or 4 decades of Marxists that have gone before him, so Marx dies in the late 1800s, Gramsci is doing his activism really in the 19-teens and 1920s. Marxists of this era have this really funny problem, which is, if you read enough of Marx's readings, he seems to predict that eventually there will be this worldwide revolution that happens in industrially advanced countries, where there's this conflict and tension between the forces of labor and the forces of capital, and that the capitalist system itself will exacerbate these forces. Eventually, these forces will cause the proletariat, the workers, to revolt both culturally. They'll finally see the nature of reality, and they'll revolt politically and overthrow capitalism and institute socialism. However, by the time Gramsci's living, this hadn't happened. There had been a socialist revolution in one place, and that's Russia. That's 1907. But what's strange for Marxists writing in this era is that the revolution should have never occurred in Russia, for a couple of reasons. In Russia, it was not an advanced industrial economy by any means at the time of the Russian Revolution. And there's little kind of organization of workers on any sort of mass scale in order to actually address the nature of economics in that country. So by the time Gramsci's around, Marxists are kind of scratching their head and going, well, this whole ideology thing that Marx talked about, it might actually work differently than he said it talks about, than he talked about. And not only that, it actually might work in a much more nefarious way than Marx could have ever imagined. So Gramsci, and I will insert his slide right here. Is writing. He's an activist. He was born to a family in the island of Sardinia, which is I believe where Napoleon was exiled. He was actually deformed from birth. He was kind of crippled, had a degenerative spinal condition that stayed with him his whole life. So he was kind of short. And by the 19 teens, he's well known both throughout Europe, especially both in Italy and Russia, as somebody that's agitating in Italy to try and reform the unequal structures of economics that are emerging in Italy in the early 1900s. Mussolini comes to power, and this is a lot of history here, but Mussolini, a fascist, imprisons Gramsci, even though Gramsci was a member of parliament. So he was elected as a socialist, as a member of the Socialist Party to parliament. Mussolini comes to power. It's Mussolini's dictatorship for quite a long time until near the end of the Second World War. And he imprisons Gramsci in 1926. Gramsci's basically in prison for the rest of his life, dies in 1937 in very ill health, much because he was kept in prison without adequate medical care. But Gramsci, being the brilliant man that he is, found that prison could cage his body, but it couldn't cage his mind, and it couldn't cage his ability to try and help workers in Italy to understand their economic situation and their political situation. So he brilliantly writes what we have come to know in the decades after. We call his book The Prison Notebooks. And he literally, it's really kind of a pieced together collection of letters and essays that he wrote in prison. However, all of his activity was monitored in prison, and his correspondence was all read by censors as it went in and out of the prison. So he developed this really intricate system of talking about political and economic developments, including Marxist concepts, but he used words that hid what they were about. And so for literally years and years and years, he was able to write these really kind of detailed analyses of culture and society and politics and economics, have them go right through the guards who would look at him, have no idea what he's talking about because it was both very complex and he was using code words, and then it would go out to people on the outside. And after his death, all this was collected into a book that we call the Prison Notebooks, where we get Gramsci's ideas from. The main concept that Gramsci is known for, and is that important to us, is this concept of hegemony. Hegemony is a little bit different than ideology. In Marx's system, ideology is kind of this superstructural thing that is kind of plopped down on people because it's directly generated from the characteristics of the economic base. For Gramsci, though, he actually thinks that ideology is not just something that's kind of imposed as a legitimating force, but actually it's much deeper, that ideology is able to keep society kind of ordered in a particular way because it's been deeply impressed on us, and because, this is important, we give consent to it. And I'll go through this in a minute. But for Gramsci, hegemony was really the workings of ideology through all of society, including members of society, because of the consent that we give to a particular reading of the world that legitimates a particular economic structure. Now let me pause there for a second and I'll be right back.